The moment they texted you back, something happened in your body before your brain even processed the words. Your chest tightened, your breathing changed. Something that had been quietly organizing itself during all those weeks of silence suddenly came undone in about 4 seconds. And here's what I want you to understand before anything else. That reaction is not weakness. It is not failure. It is your nervous system responding exactly the way it was designed to respond when a significant attachment signal reappears after a period of loss. It is biological, it is involuntary, and it is completely distinct from the choice you are about to make. Because here's what nobody is telling you about this moment. The moment an avoidant comes back is not primarily a moment about them. It is a diagnostic moment about you. And what it is diagnosing is whether the time since they left transformed you or just temporarily rearranged you. Those are two completely different things, and the difference between them is going to determine everything about what happens next. So stay with me, because by the end of this, I'm going to give you something more useful than advice. I'm going to give you a framework for understanding your own nervous system response so precisely that the next move becomes obvious. Not because I told you what to do, but because you can finally see clearly enough to choose it yourself. Let me start with something that most people in this situation get fundamentally wrong. They think the question is, should I let them back in? That is not the question. The real question is, who am I when they show up? Because the avoidant who just reached out is not interacting with a situation. They are interacting with a frequency. They are interacting with the specific emotional energy that you are currently broadcasting. Not the words you choose, not the response time you carefully calculated, not the tone you practiced in your head before hitting send. Your actual current emotional state. And avoidants, whatever their limitations in emotional intimacy, are extraordinarily sensitive readers of emotional frequency. Decades of navigating relationships from behind protective distance has made them highly attuned to the difference between someone who has genuinely changed internally and someone who is performing change while still being organized around the same emotional need. They feel the difference before the conversation is 3 messages long. This is why the standard advice, play it cool, take your time responding, do not seem too eager, almost never works long term. Because it is a performance layered over an unchanged emotional foundation, and performances have cracks, and avoidants find cracks. The only thing that actually changes the dynamic when an avoidant returns is genuine internal transformation. Not the appearance of it, not the strategy of it, the actual thing. So let me tell you what that actually looks like, and more importantly, what it feels like from the inside, because you need to be able to tell the difference in yourself before you respond to a single word they sent. There is a concept in attachment psychology called earned security. It was first described by researchers studying adults who had insecure attachment styles in childhood but developed secure attachment function as adults. And what distinguished them from people who remained insecurely attached was not that they had easier lives or better subsequent relationships, it was that they had done something specific with their difficult experiences. They had processed them into coherent narrative. They could tell the story of what happened to them, including the painful parts, including the parts where they made mistakes, including the parts where they were hurt by people they loved, without either minimizing that story or being emotionally consumed by it. The story was integrated. It had a beginning, a middle, and a meaning. And that integration changed how their nervous system responded to new relational experiences. They stopped responding from the wound and started responding from the understanding of the wound. That is the difference between someone who is genuinely transformed and someone who is performing distance. And here is why this matters right now, in this specific moment, with this specific text on your screen. If you are still emotionally organized around whether this person chooses you, you have not yet reached earned security. You are still in the wound, and responding from the wound, no matter how controlled your words are, will recreate the dynamic you are trying to escape. If you are emotionally organized around your own clarity about what you need and what you will not accept, you have moved toward earned security. And responding from that place will create something neither of you has experienced in this dynamic before. Let me make this concrete, because I am not interested in leaving you with philosophy when I can give you something you can actually use. Here's what the wound response looks like in practice. They send a message. It is casual, low stakes, maybe a meme, maybe "I have been thinking about you," maybe just your name followed by nothing. And your first internal response is a calculation. How long should I wait before responding? What tone makes me seem unbothered? What do I say that communicates that I have changed without closing the door entirely? Every one of those questions is organized around managing their perception of you. And the reason that is a problem is not that it is manipulative. It is that it is fear-based. And fear-based responses, even carefully managed ones, carry a specific energetic signature that communicates the opposite of what you are trying to communicate. You are trying to communicate that you no longer need them to choose you, but the calculation itself reveals that you still do. Now here is what the clarity response looks like. They send the same message. And your first internal response is not a calculation about them. It is an honest assessment of yourself. Do I actually want to re-engage with this person? Not do I want them back. Not do I still have feelings. Those are real and valid and separate questions. The question is, do I want to invest attention, time, and emotional presence into this interaction right now? If the answer is no, you do not respond. Not as strategy. Not to create distance. Simply because you are genuinely organizing your life around your own priorities, and this does not currently fit them. If the answer is yes, you respond naturally, without performance, without calculation, without the undertow of hope that you are trying to hide. And here is what changes everything about that second scenario. When you respond from genuine internal clarity, rather than from managed performance, your message carries a different quality that the avoidance nervous system detects immediately. Not because you said something clever, because you are not afraid of the outcome. And someone who is not afraid of losing them is someone the avoidant has almost never encountered before. Because here is the psychological reality of most avoidant relationships that nobody says plainly enough. The avoidant's emotional control over the dynamic depends entirely on the other person's fear of losing them. That fear, the fear of saying the wrong thing, responding too fast, being too much, being too little, pushing them away again. That fear is the engine that keeps the avoidant in the position of emotional authority. The moment that fear genuinely disappears, not is suppressed, not is performed away, but actually dissolves because you have done the internal work that makes their return less important than your own forward movement, the entire power structure of the dynamic reorganizes. And the avoidant feels it, immediately and completely. Now I want to address something that most people are thinking at this exact point in the video but will not say out loud. You are thinking, but I do still want them back. I do still have feelings. I cannot just manufacture indifference to their return because I have watched enough psychology content. And you are right, you cannot. And anyone telling you to fake it is giving you advice that will create a short-term result and a long-term collapse. So I am not going to tell you to be indifferent. I am going to tell you something more honest and more useful. You are allowed to have feelings about their return. You are allowed to feel the pull of the connection, the hope, the complicated mix of relief and caution and remembered warmth that surfaces when someone important reappears. All of that is allowed. The question is not whether you feel it. The question is whether those feelings are in the driver's seat of your decisions or whether something more grounded is. In behavioral psychology, there is a distinction between being run by an emotion and being aware of an emotion. Two people can feel the exact same level of hope or longing or anxiety about a situation. The person being run by it makes decisions that are organized around managing or satisfying that feeling. The person who is aware of it can feel it completely while still choosing their response from a different place. That capacity, to feel fully without being driven by what you feel, is not a personality trait you either have or do not have. It is a skill. And it develops the same way every skill develops. Through practice, through self-awareness, through the gradual accumulation of moments where you chose awareness over reaction. And here is the part that connects directly back to the avoidant standing at your door. When you respond to their return from awareness, rather than from the emotion the return activated, you do something the avoidant is not prepared for. You make them feel the uncertainty. Not as a strategy, not as a game, but as the natural consequence of interacting with someone who is no longer emotionally predictable in the way they once were. Let me explain why uncertainty is significant here. because I do not mean uncertainty as cruelty. I mean it in a precise psychological sense. Avoidants maintain emotional distance as a regulation strategy. They keep people at a calibrated distance that feels safe, close enough for connection, far enough to avoid the threat response that deep intimacy triggers. And in order to maintain that calibrated distance, they need to be able to predict your emotional position. If they know you are emotionally waiting for them, they can keep the dial exactly where it is comfortable for their nervous system. They know you are there. They know how much you want them. They know the precise emotional distance they can maintain while keeping you in orbit. But when your emotional position becomes genuinely unclear, not because you are performing coolness, but because you have genuinely shifted your center of gravity away from them, the dial they were counting on stops working. They can no longer calibrate. And for an avoidant, the loss of calibration creates something unusual. Not panic, but attention. A kind of focused curiosity that feels different from the comfortable certainty of knowing someone is waiting. This is the psychological mechanism behind the phenomenon you have probably heard described as pulling away to attract. But the popular framing of that idea is almost always wrong. It describes it as a tactic, as something you do deliberately to manufacture a result. That framing misses the entire point. The shift that actually affects an avoidant is not performed distance. It is the genuine reorientation of your emotional life around your own growth, your own clarity, and your own forward movement. And that reorientation cannot be faked because it is not primarily about how you act toward them. It is about where your internal attention lives. When your internal attention genuinely lives somewhere other than in the question of whether they will fully choose you, your entire presence changes. Your messages feel different. Your silences feel different. The quality of your attention in conversation is different. And avoidance, whose entire psychological architecture was built on reading the emotional environment for signals, notice that difference at a level that bypasses conscious processing. Now I want to talk about the moment itself, the actual response. Because I have spent all of this time on the internal foundation, and you deserve something concrete about the external expression. When an avoidant returns and you have done genuine internal work, here is what the right response actually looks and feels like. It is not cold, it does not punish, it does not perform indifference or weaponize silence, or deliver emotional speeches about what they put you through. Not because those feelings are wrong, but because communicating from those places is still organized around them. It is still asking them to do something, feel guilty, take responsibility, acknowledge your pain. And asking someone to give you something is still a form of emotional dependency, even when what you are asking for is accountability. The response that actually shifts things is simpler and much harder than any of those options. It is honest. Not brutally honest, not performatively honest. Just genuinely, quietly, self-respectfully honest. It sounds like, I am glad to hear from you. I have done a lot of thinking since we last spoke. I am open to talking, but I want to be honest that I am not in the same place I was before. Some things would need to be different for me to invest in this again. Notice what that response does not contain. It does not beg. It does not punish. It does not close the door or perform indifference. But it also does not fling the door open. It creates a threshold that requires them to step through with something real. And the avoidance response to that threshold will tell you in about 48 hours everything you spent months trying to understand. Because an avoidant who has genuinely done internal work will meet that threshold with curiosity and willingness. They will ask what would need to be different. They will offer something real about what they have been processing. They will demonstrate, through behavior rather than words, that the return is not simply a repetition of the pattern. And an avoidant who has not done internal work will retreat at the threshold, will get vague, will reintroduce the same emotional ambiguity that defined the dynamic before, will respond in a way that makes you feel like you said the wrong thing, when what actually happened is that you created a standard they are not yet equipped to meet. And here's the most important thing I can tell you about that second outcome. It is information, not rejection. It is not evidence that you said the wrong thing. It is not evidence that you were too much or not enough. It is direct, clear behavioral data about where this person actually is in their own work. And that data is worth more than any conversation you could have had while hoping they would show you who they were without requiring them to demonstrate it. The people who stay stuck in avoidant dynamics for years are not stuck because they lack emotional intelligence. Most of them have extraordinary emotional intelligence, which is part of why the dynamic is so costly for them. They're stuck because they keep accepting words as evidence when behavior is the only actual evidence. He said he knows he hurt you. She said she has been thinking about things. They said it will be different. None of that is evidence. All of that is words. The threshold response I gave you does not ask for words. It asks for something real. And the reaction to that ask is the only evidence that matters. Now let me close with something I want you to sit with genuinely rather than just hear. The strongest version of this entire dynamic is not one where you perfectly execute emotional distance and the avoidant realizes your value and transforms overnight and comes back completely healed and you live in secure attachment ever after. That version exists. It does happen. But it is not the goal. The goal is you. Specifically, the version of you that exists on the other side of genuinely processing this dynamic rather than performing your way through it. Because when you do the actual internal work, when you build the earned security that comes from integrating your experience into coherent understanding rather than protecting yourself from it, you become someone different in every relationship going forward. Not just this one. You become someone whose self-worth is not contingent on being chosen by any specific person. Someone whose emotional clarity is stable enough to survive someone else's ambivalence without reorganizing around it. Someone who can offer deep connection from a place of genuine security rather than from the anxious generosity of someone trying to earn their place. Because her empathy did not disappear when she reclaimed herself. It evolved. She can still read people with the same extraordinary precision she always had. She can still trace a person's behavior back to its origins, understand the wound underneath the pattern, see the story that produced the person. She still does all of that. She simply no longer accepts the conclusions of that understanding as instructions for what she should do next. Understanding someone and accepting their patterns as your responsibility to absorb, those are two entirely different things, and she has finally separated them. That separation is the last piece of the transformation, and it is the piece that makes it permanent. Let me tell you the most important thing I can say to you today, and I mean this for two different kinds of people watching this. That person, the one you are building toward, does not need the avoidant to return transformed in order to be okay. They are already okay. And from that place of already being okay, every outcome becomes navigable. The avoidant returns genuinely changed. You have the clarity to recognize it and the security to receive it without losing yourself. The avoidant returns unchanged. You have the groundedness to see it quickly and the self-respect to honor the threshold you set. The avoidant does not return at all. You have the forward momentum to keep building the life you started constructing in the silence after they left. All three of those outcomes are available to you, but only from the foundation of genuine internal work. Specifically, the version of you that exists on the other side of genuinely processing this dynamic rather than performing your way through it. Because when you do the actual internal work, when you build the earned security that comes from integrating your experience into coherent understanding rather than protecting yourself from it, you become someone different in every relationship going forward, not just this one. You become someone whose self-worth is not contingent on being chosen by any specific person. Someone whose emotional clarity is stable enough to survive someone else's ambivalence without reorganizing around it. Someone who can offer deep connection from a place of genuine security rather than from the anxious generosity of someone trying to earn their place. Not performance, not strategy, not the right response template. The actual, unglamorous, slow, private work of becoming someone whose emotional world is centered on their own clarity rather than someone else's choice. That is the only response that actually changes the dynamic, and it starts before you type a single word back. If this landed somewhere specific for you, I want to hear about it in the comments. Particularly this: when they came back, what was the first thing you felt? Not what you wanted to feel, not what you think you should have felt. What actually happened in your body in that first moment? Because the answer to that question contains a map of your current attachment state. And that map is exactly where the real work begins. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the psychology that most relationship content never touches. Next, I'm breaking down the specific internal shift that separates people who break the avoidance cycle permanently from people who repeat it indefinitely. And the difference has nothing to do with what they say or do. It is entirely about one internal orientation that most people spend years accidentally developing in the wrong direction. You are going to want to see that one.